Our keynote speaker this evening, Dr. Kira Hudson-Banks, is an associate professor in the Department of Psychology at St. Louis University. Her research examines the experiences of discrimination, its impact on mental health, and intergroup relations. She has published in the journals American Psychologist, Cultural Diversity and Ethnic Minority Psychology, and Diversity in Higher Education, as well as the Harvard Business Review, Huffington Post, and The Atlantic. As a consultant, she has worked with schools, communities, institutions of higher education, and businesses to improve their diversity and inclusion efforts and engage people in productive dialogue and action. She served as a racial equity consultant for the Ferguson Commission and has continued as the racial equity catalyst for Forward Through Ferguson. Her consulting firm, The Mouse and the Elephant, is committed to developing customized curricula to meet companies' long-term needs. She received her Bachelor of Arts from Mount Holyoke College, where she was inducted into Phi Beta Kappa, and she earned her master's degree and PhD from the University of Michigan. Tonight's presentation is titled Leadership Courage as an Active Ingredient of Inclusion. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Banks.
Good evening. All right, let me get my timer set up and my clicker set up. All right. So I want to just start with a thank you, actually. I want to thank Sonia Mao and Linda Bolivar for their invitation to speak and supporting me to bring me back to this former hometown. Bloomington Normal really will always be a special place to me. It's where I landed my first academic position straight out of graduate school. It's where I birthed both of my children, even though they were born in the same hospital, but one birth certificate says Normal, the other says Bloomington, so I have both covered. I earned tenure here. I began my leadership journey here, and so it's really special to be here specifically for this graduation. And I feel like I want to take the opportunity to just publicly name and thank Kathy Olafson and Deanna Frauci and Loretta Thirtyacre, who saw something in me in 2006, I think it was, or maybe even 5, and encouraged me to start consulting. As a professor, I do a lot of teaching, right? That's why we have the PowerPoint, so you know where we're going and you know our take-home points. But they encouraged me to consult, and it's something that I love to do. I now love to do, and 10 years later, I have consulted for international firms, Fortune 550, schools, nonprofits, and to me, it's like the playground of the theoretical ideas that we have in the ivory tower. Consulting is where you can make it come alive. And so I just want to say thank you to those women for encouraging me to begin my leadership journey in terms of starting my own consulting work. However, one of the things I want to focus on today is that some of the most challenging moments of leadership for me have been in the past few years. Living in St. Louis, we moved to St. Louis in 2011, and my work as an academic who studies discrimination and the impact that it has on mental health became all too real and up close as Mike Brown Jr.'s murder led to unrest in Ferguson. And the decisions of how to engage and when to engage have literally shaped my worldview, my scholarship, and even my employment. So tonight I want to speak to you about the importance of courage as an active ingredient in being a leader and fostering inclusion. And so I plan to also weave some of my own personal reflections through these 3 points. So these are my core messages that I hope you walk away with today. 1, that inclusion starts with you. 2, that listening to the voices of others requires us to be courageous and to be vulnerable. And 3, policy, so rules, laws, norms, practices can precede personal development. So we don't have to wait for everyone to get to be where we are. When we are leaders, we can create and shape the policies and procedures and norms in the institutions and organizations that we inhabit. Actually, one more thing. So to the graduates, I just want to make sure that I speak directly to you from the beginning. I hope that my message gives you, one, some ideas to consider, two, some information to expand your knowledge base around inclusion, and three, some comfort that you don't have to have it all figured out to put one foot in front of the other. As your class speaker mentioned, leadership is not always linear, and it's not always clear. So my first point, that inclusion starts with you. I want to make this point really clear because the paradox of inclusion, we often think about including other people, actually requires you to be self-aware. That to be inclusive of other people can sometimes be misguided, and you aren't able to do it as well if you don't have self-awareness. And so up here you'll see on the screen this framework of cultural competency from psychology. We argue that it takes awareness, knowledge, and then skill to be culturally competent. And I think that this speaks to leadership and simply being a culturally competent human being. So often we jump to asking for do's and don'ts. So I get asked to come into an organization and they say, Kira, just tell us what we need to do or tell us what we need to not do, and we'll be good, right? And my response is no, actually. You can often be misguided and misaligned in what you do if you don't have an awareness of yourself, where you're located, where you're positioned, your own identity. So to be an effective leader that includes others requires that you be willing to look inside. And the reality is that getting to know yourself is no small feat. And sometimes it requires courage, right, to be willing to shine a light on some of those aspects of ourselves that can go unnoticed or unexamined. It takes courage to wade through our own identities and what that actually might mean for our relationship with others. I often use the analogy of the mouse and the elephant, also the name of one of my firms, that helps us to think about the landscape of our identities, right? Where are we the mouse? Where are we the elephant? And this idea of self-awareness is important, right? That as the elephant, it's really important for me to understand not only that the mouse exists, but my relationship to the mouse, as you can see in the picture. Right? So I have an example here of myself. I identify as a Black woman. I also identify as Christian. I work at St. Louis University, which is a Jesuit institution. And so for me to understand how I can be inclusive of my students who identify as Muslim in my lab, I have to be proactive in making sure that they have the days that they need around Ramadan or whatever they need in terms of their experience of their religion. And to ignore how I might trample upon, if you think about the mouse and the elephant dynamic, trample on their experience would be false. I have to understand how, as a Christian, not only do I live in a society that literally doesn't deliver mail on my holidays, but I also work in an institution that actually closes down for my holidays. So there's a lot that's built up in the institution that supports who I am. And so me simply saying, oh yeah, you're welcome in our lab, you're welcome in this institution, isn't enough. To be a leader that is about inclusiveness, I must also understand my positionality in relation to my student, not wait for them to come to me to ask for what they need, but for me to realize my relationship to their identity and ask, what can I do to help you feel more included here? What do you need? And that requires me being willing to be vulnerable and not just say you're welcome because you're here, right? That diversity numerically is not how we get to inclusion. It doesn't just happen by having people from different backgrounds. It happens when we are active and we engage it. And as leaders in an organization, we have a responsibility. As elephants in an organization, we have a responsibility to make sure we understand not only that the mouse exists, but our relationship to those who have identities that are traditionally marginalized. Number 2, listening to the voices of others. So once you've done the work of thinking about where you're positioned and how your identity and how it affects your relationship with others, you've then got to go that next step of listening to the voices of others, right? So in my example, I talked about not only recognizing my own identity, but also thinking about, okay, what is the experience of my students who identify as Muslim, right? And I want to just name that this can be a hard step. It's easier said than done because, as this picture shows, there's a lot of smog in the air in terms of what we know about other, what we know about those people, or what we know about or what we even think about other people. And if we're honest with ourselves, it's really important that we, as folks in leadership positions, that we acknowledge this idea of I don't have a prejudiced bone in my body as not being an accurate statement. That in actuality, as a psychologist, I can argue that stereotypes, shortcuts, mental shortcuts, are not inherently negative. It's when we don't stop and are not aware of how they're driving our behavior that they can be negative, right? So we have to own up to the fact that there's, in terms of race, gender, sexual orientation, religion, all sorts of social identities, that we are fed and we breathe in smog that shapes how we think about people groups. And so we all have that, and so we're gonna breathe it, we're breathing it in, we're gonna cough it up sometimes. And so being a leader that is willing to have the courage to say, I have biases, and I need to understand how I can be aware of them to not let those drive my behavior. It's not enough to say, I'm gonna be bias-free, right? And so really thinking about having the courage and the willingness and the vulnerability to say, I have biases, I'm willing to explore that, is an essential part of being an inclusive leader. The other barrier that can come in listening to voices of others is this idea that we have in our society around being colorblind, that rhetoric that can predominate. Well, I didn't even notice you were black. Right? Well, please do. It's a part of how I see myself, right? I want you to notice it. I just don't want you to limit my access and opportunities on the basis of it, right? And people often say, well, didn't Dr. King say that we should be colorblind? And my response is often, no. He actually said he wanted us to be judged by the content of our character, not the color of our skin. He didn't say, let's not see the color of our skin, right? And I won't go into the whole history lesson of how colorblindness came to be in our society as a concept and as a construct, but I want to plant a seed and problematize it, that it's not the way out, that it's not the way to solve our problems of inclusiveness. And I say colorblindness because there's been research on it, and the research suggests that when we claim to be colorblind, we actually can be more biased. And because it is it's a data point, and we use it to make inferences and to make decisions, so to claim to not use it can actually increase people's bias in using race as a way to make decisions. And it's not just race, right? We shouldn't be gender blind, we shouldn't be sexual orientation blind, we should be moving to a place where we can name, acknowledge, and not use those factors as driving factors in making decisions about individuals. Right? So I really want to problematize that idea that colorblindness will save us. Now, in actuality, it does not save us. And if you think about different parts of who you are and your identity and what makes up who you are, whether it's your religion, your gender, being a parent, being a veteran, and if I were to say, I don't see that, that's really not important. It might make you feel some type of way about that person, right? It's not something that engenders genuine relationship. And when we're talking about being a leader, being inclusive, being a servant leader, it's about respecting how other people see themselves, right? And so I think it's really important to think about the courage that it takes and the vulnerability that it takes to, even if it's not the way you see the world, to be able to listen to how other people experience the world and acknowledge that. The example that I want to give here is a recent consulting client that I was working with. It was a group training session. There was an older white gentleman in the group who said, I actually don't see any problems at our company. And in fact, I feel like we have no problems because in the past 10 years, I've only had people of color or women to report to. And I said, all right, that's your experience, right? Let's hear from others. What are other people's experiences? Through the course of the day, we had a woman that talked about having disparaging remarks made to her, people saying that because she was a woman that she wasn't as good of a negotiator, someone saying that another woman saying that because she was younger, people were assuming that she was lacking experience, even though she had closed over 100 deals. This was in a bank. And another colleague mentioned, this was a black man, mentioned that he comes to the building on the weekend to work, right? He's in a supervisory role and has a lot of work to do, and he sees people who will hold doors for each other and let each other in, yet he's consistently stopped and asked for his ID to be checked by security, and doors aren't held for him. And so same company, right? Very different experiences. And the reason why I feel like this story fits so much this idea of listening to the voices of others and being courageous enough and vulnerable enough to let those voices in and let them shape you is because this white gentleman could have easily dismissed those comments as anomalies. Oh, well, that's just their singular experiences. But he realized, why dismiss their singular experiences as anecdotal, but hold up my own as the only truth? And so as the day went on, he really became willing to not only listen to those voices, but to also acknowledge the ways in which race and gender were shaping everyone's experience, just in very different ways. And so I hope that little story helps you to understand why actually seeing differences is what can help us leverage what diversity can bring us. The innovation, the creativity requires us to not be colorblind, but to see it and to hear each other and to understand and be vulnerable enough to take in other people's experiences and learn from them. And my third point here is about policy being able to precede personal development. And I'll say a little bit more about this and unpack it, but just as this moving walkway that we all have been on in the airport, right, can move us in a different direction, institutions and organizations and systems are moving in a direction. The way that they're built, the policies that they have, whether intentional, unwritten, or explicit, they're moving in a direction. And as leaders, we have the opportunity and the responsibility, I would say, to change which way the organization is going, should it not be in the direction of inclusion. And the way that organizations and institutions shift and change is through creating different policies, creating different norms, right? Creating a different culture. And leadership very much shapes that. And so I want to speak to the fact that we don't have to, as leaders, wait for everyone to get on board or everyone to catch up to be able to shape and create a new experience, an inclusive experience in a company. So I once worked with an organization. The CEO brought me in because he was concerned about women in leadership. And what he realized is that while they had a very gender balanced, actually, I think it was 60-40 women in terms of employees, that was not reflected at leadership levels. And what was very convicting to him is that he was the father of 2 girls. And he started to understand that he was, in his company, doing something. He didn't know what, but something was happening that even though statistically women were in the company, they weren't rising to leadership, and that he wanted his daughters to have the possibility of being in leadership just as he had in the business world. And so, long story short, he brought us in and we worked with them to reevaluate how they mentor to be more intentional, how they evaluate employees, and what they realized that there were ways in which they were biasing in an in-group bias way, because oftentimes people think about bias as I'm biased against or away from folks who are different than me. Research would actually suggest that it's the in-group bias that is most pernicious. So being somebody who was educated at University of Michigan, right? It's not so much that I need to be aware, although I do need to be aware of how I'm biased towards people who were educated at other institutions, but how I might privilege those who are educated from my institution, right? So that in-group bias. So what they realized at this company is that there were a lot of ways in which they were favoring men and extroversion and the people who were getting the development opportunities, right? And so it wasn't that they needed to necessarily create a specific pipeline for women. They needed to get more intentional about making sure that there was a mentorship opportunity for everyone, not just by happenstance, right? They needed to make sure that they shifted, as the class speaker mentioned, to look for introversion and to not just promote for extroversion, yeah? And so I name that because the CEO didn't have to wait for everyone to have that aha moment or everyone to have some daughters to care about women in leadership. He had the power, and he decided, yes, as an organization, as an institution, I see which way we're going, and we're going to shift this because I have the responsibility, and I'm willing to be courageous enough to change our policies, to change our mentoring and evaluation system so that we can try to have some different outcomes here, some more equitable outcomes on the basis of gender. So my take home here is, if you see a problem, solve it. Don't wait for others always to feel compelled to solve it along with you. If you are in a leadership position and you've done the work of number 1 and 2, right, thinking about how you are important in inclusion, knowing yourself, listening to the voices of others, you very well might have an analysis that others are lacking. And I think about my work in St. Louis. I worked with the Ferguson Commission and am now working with Forward Through Ferguson, the entity that came after the commission sunset. I really have seen that in St. Louis and beyond, that policy change is possible if the leadership is willing to be courageous and to create next practices rather than solely relying on best practices. So often we say, well, what's the best practice? Well, what's been done elsewhere? And sometimes in terms of these problems of inclusion that we have not solved in our society, there's not a best practice. That you are charged with creating the best next practice that others might follow as a best practice. So be willing to look for those opportunities as a leader. I'm going to shift now to thinking about and telling a quick story about how I've interwoven these same points that I'm sharing with you in my own work. So Ferguson, it's really defined what's happened in St. Louis for the past 3 years, right, after Mike Brown's shooting. And I just want to name that for me it was really a moment of reflection and a challenge to myself. And it shaped the way that I think about my work. It pushed me to reflect on my role as an academic. And thinking about my own status, my own elephantness. Here I am, an academic who has this PhD and who studies discrimination in mental health. And here it's happening literally outside my doors when we think about people who are engaged in protest. And it pushed me to say, I actually see what's happening in St. Louis, and it's not what I see on TV, right? And I said, if I'm going to be someone who's a leader and an expert on understanding discrimination in mental health, then I need to step outside my comfort zone, and I need to go actually engage with protesters. I need to engage with activists. I need to understand their experience, because what they're showing me on TV is not what I'm seeing in the streets. And so that led me to, again, think about how am I going to remain a leader in this field? I need to listen to the voices of others. And so what I learned is that these young people are passionate, and they actually speak to a cohort effect. These young people that were not professional activists, that were not professional organizers, were raised in that colorblind rhetoric. They were told, you can be anything you want to be. You can do anything you want to do. They were also the generation that was told, your voice matters. You get a participation trophy, right? You being here matters, and I want to hear what you have to say, and you are valued. And many of them were educated young people who had not seen what was happening in their city and to other young Black people through a racial lens. And they were having this aha moment. And so to see their passion, really their love for the country, they're challenging what they were seeing as a pure injustice that was about Mac Brown, but was about much larger inequities in St. Louis and in our country, really humbled me. And it taught me a lot about what it means to really humble myself and listen to how other people are seeing the world, right? So I didn't jump in and share all my knowledge about the systemic nature of oppression and racism. I really listened. I pushed myself to understand how they were seeing the world. And in a way, I couldn't really argue with them because they were getting a lot done. There was a lot of movement and interest into the topic of racial inequity that organizations who were professionally doing this hadn't been able to garner. And in the course of my relationship with the young people and the activists in the community, I came to respect them and admire them immensely. They were this inspiration that pushed me to say, okay, I have this research that I'm doing, and it's over here in the academic ivory tower, but how is it connecting to the community? How is it impacting and the community and their experience right now? And so I began to get involved and go to some events with them and go to different protest events to listen to their experiences. And then one night we were tear gassed. And we were tear gassed near the park that I would exercise in, the neighborhood where I lived, and right next to restaurants and ice cream stores that my family would frequent. And it was a moment that was surreal for me because I had been getting to know these young people, been at different events. We hadn't had this experience before. And so after that experience of getting tear gassed, the local lawyers asked if I wanted to be a part of, they were going to file a restraining order against the police for unlawful use of tear gas and asked me to be a part of the litigation. And I said yes. And I could have said no because I was scared. I didn't have tenure yet at St. Louis University. I could have said no because, the optics of suing the police didn't look so good. But I said yes because it was clear that from my being out and connected, that the way that these young people were treated was not the way that other gatherings were treated. Like we were literally unlawfully tear gassed. And I say this to challenge probably what you all saw on the news and to name that the quote unquote rioting or dangerousness that got pushed by the media happened literally a handful of times out of hundreds of nights of protesting. And so I said yes because that narrative was false. And I said yes because I felt compelled to testify and use my elephantness. Here I am, a professor at a university who researches this topic and who had an ongoing relationship with these young people. And what happened was that I was in the session with the federal judge, and she started to ask questions, and she started to ask about my research, and she started to ask about my experience engaging with these young people. And she ended up agreeing with the lawyers to say that this was unlawful, and it has led to policy change that we now, as peaceful protesters, right, the police have to give warning, and they have to give a proper way to leave, so egress, right? And so this is now a policy change. So when we think about the marches that happened for science today, or the Women's March that happened earlier this year, or other marches, right, there's now a policy in place that regardless of how the police might feel or the media's attitudes towards a group, it is now unlawful, which you might think, well, wasn't it before? Well, it hadn't been articulated, to use those sorts of methods on a peaceful group of protesters. And so I name that to just say that was a moment for me when I could have shied away. Oh, this happened, I shouldn't talk about it. This isn't, because of the narrative of what was put out there, I shouldn't be associated with that. But I chose to use my elephantness to say, no, these young people, we aren't hearing what they're saying because we aren't being inclusive and really listening to their experience. We are allowing the smog, the narrative, to shape how we see them, rather than including and finding a way to bring them to the table to find solutions to our problem. And so I want to move to close just to say that my work with Forward Through Ferguson and the Commission has been about how we make sure, as we solve our problems as a region, that we don't end up in the same place 25 years from now, that we truly listen to the voices of young people and move towards racial equity, which we would call an outcome where race no longer predicts a place where race no longer predicts outcomes. So it's a lofty goal, but our hope is that we move towards this vision and that we actually don't have to wait for everyone's hearts and minds to be changed. That if we as leaders are courageous enough and we disaggregate our data and understand the disparate experiences that people are having on the basis of all aspects of diversity, that we as leaders can, rather than just raise awareness, can actually shape and change policy. One of the examples that I like to share here is the equality versus equity. Folks might have seen this before. There's different versions of this, but it basically suggests that giving equality is everyone needs a riser, right? But as you can see, not everyone still can see the game. Not everyone can still be engaged. That equity is about using our awareness, using the knowledge of the problem, and then offering a solution that truly gives everyone an opportunity to be a part of the game, right? And the reality is that we know that race doesn't mean anything in terms of genetics, right? If folks don't know that, we now know from the Human Genome Project, we are more alike across racial groups than we are different. We actually have more genetic variability within what we call racial groups than we do across. And yet, it has very real social consequences in terms of health, wealth, education, infant mortality. The list can go on, right? And so it's essential that as leaders, just like the group that just presented their work with pride and thinking about LGBTQ individuals, that we not just raise awareness, but that we really move to create more equitable solutions. The research on disparities suggests that it will take a generation, 25 years of concerted efforts to close these disparity gaps that we see. And that it's important that we ask the questions and do the work and have the audacity to create these next practices. The solutions aren't going to be easy, and I'm confident that we can solve them if we work together, but it's going to require us to be innovative, to be inclusive, and then set the policies that will create a more inclusive environment. And I would actually argue that true inclusion, informed by courageous leaders, can get us to this place of equity, where all of the different identities can be seen and acknowledged, yet they don't predict people's outcomes. My belief is that leading in the coming decades will require all of us to be self-aware, to have the courage and capacity to listen to the voices of others, and the audacity to create inclusive policies. I want to leave you with this myth and bust it, in that people often say, oh, well, Kira, it's always been this way. It always will. Someone's always going to be on the bottom. Or we need to, oh, it's great to think about diversity and how people are different, but they're not really compelled to do something different about the inequity that we see on the basis of those aspects of diversity. And so I want to charge you with the fact that the reality is change is always happening. Change is always happening. It's happening now. It's happening now. And we can be a part of shaping how things change and move if we acknowledge that as leaders, we have the responsibility, and if we take on the courage to create different, equitable policies. So to the MCLP class of 2017, I want to say be courageous and be willing to do the hard work of inclusion. Congratulations on completing this leg of the journey, and thank you for inviting me to speak with you tonight.